Okay, good evening, and welcome to the School of Visual Arts and to the Department of Design Research, Writing and Criticism. My name's Alice. It's nice to see you all here tonight. And I want to take this little housekeeping opportunity to remind you we are still accepting applications for the fall. So if you know people interested in refining their practice as design researchers, writers, critics, then please send them our way. There are little pink bookmarks on the seats and in the reading room where we'll be gathering after the lecture, so you can grab one of those. You can also visit our website, follow us on Twitter. URL is designresearch.sva.edu. And also keep attending our lectures. We have videos, I think, of most of the lectures, so if the ones that you have missed, they're also on our website. And we have a few more coming up for the remainder of this semester that you might want to mark your calendars for. But I especially want you to mark your calendar for this. This is the project that we are really in the midst of at the moment and very excited about. Normally, when we graduate the students at the end of the year, we hold a conference. And this year we've decided to throw things up in the air a bit and organize an exhibition called Exploding Footnotes, which puts the process of design research into the spotlight and kind of excavates all that juicy material that often ends up at the very bottom of the page and brings it out on view. So we're working through this at the moment, new territory for us. But May 13th is the day when it will be open to the public, and there will be kind of live crits taking place with all sorts of esteemed and interesting guest critics. So watch this space for more information on that. Okay. So ever since the magazine publishing industry apparently vaporized back in around 2009, taking all design magazines with it, I've been waiting and watching for meaningful experimentation in the field of journalism, and particularly the aspects that address design. I was really curious to know, what would these new revenue models look like? What new formats would emerge in a post-article and post-post era? What skills would a 21st century journalist need to be able to create a piece of writing? What kinds of value would be ascribed to that writing? And I don't just mean monetary value, but beyond that. How would readers encounter this new writing? And would it even be called writing anymore? So from time to time, I would hear other people asking these questions or see fragments of answers. And meanwhile, we forged ahead, building our hybrid writing practices here. We trained the students in radio, podcasting, video, curating, event planning. We assumed criticism could take the form of a pop-up exhibition, a progressive dinner party, or an augmented reality app. Some of the examples you can see here. And every now and again, we'd keep checking back into that publishing landscape to see if there were any new shapes on the horizon. But for a long while, it didn't seem that there were. And then a couple of years ago, an online digital news, business news publication appeared called Quartz. It really commanded attention in both the breadth and the depth of its reporting, and especially in its policy of providing open access to its reporting data and its own open source data visualization software. These seem to me to be very interesting qualities. I've invited its editor-in-chief and president, Kevin Delaney, to talk to us tonight, because I truly think Quartz is doing something important, not only in terms of business journalism, and in expanding our conception of the ways in which a writer must engage with the production of a story in a really kind of new, hands-on way, but also in terms of the way in which design is treated. I'm happy to say that one of our alums, Anne Keto, where are you, Anne? Yay, she's there. Was recently hired as a design reporter at Quartz and is writing up a storm over there on topics ranging from mattress buying and edible coffee cups to Indonesian architecture and cat videos, of course. So, as biased as I am toward my students and alums, it is actually Anne's boss who I've invited here tonight. So I should introduce him. Kevin Delaney is editor-in-chief and president of Quartz, as I mentioned, which he co-founded in 2012. He was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal for a decade, based in Paris and San Francisco, before he became managing editor of WSJ.com. Earlier in his career, Kevin was a reporter for SmartMoney Magazine and a TV producer in Montreal. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he is the Hearst Digital Media Professor in Residence at Columbia University for the current year. So Kevin has kindly agreed to give an overview of what is involved in running a digitally native news, business news outlet, the rise of digital storytelling in newsmaking, and specifically how he continues to build and iterate Quartz as a web app, as a brand, and as a new genre of business journalism. If you can do all that in the next 40 minutes, I'll be extremely impressed. But please welcome to the podium, Kevin Delaney. Thank you.
So, thank you for having me here today. This is a community I have incredible respect for, and Quito is doing you very proud here. So she's doing great. She started with us recently, but in general, and I'll talk about this as we go along. You may like this, you may not like this, but all of the journalists at Quartz we think of as designers as well, and it's part of how the demands and the opportunities of journalism and news have changed. So I'll go into what that means specifically. So what I thought I would do today is talk a little. This is a sort of rough outline of how I'm going to walk through this. Talk about what Quartz is a little bit as a way of introducing what we're trying to do and the birth of Quartz. I'd like to talk a little bit as a bit of a sidebar about the name Quartz, which curiously is a question that I never get asked, why Quartz is called Quartz. So I'm going to impose on you the story because I think it might actually be, it's instructive in how you go about naming things and thinking about a brand. We're going to take a step back into the state of publishing that we arrived into, the vestiges, the barnacles, the frictions, and just briefly diagnose them. And then we're going to talk about what Quartz is and storytelling, and go from there into the change that is upon us even 2 years in and how we're thinking about continuing to evolve into that. So diving right in, why Quartz? So this is a question I probably did not think about enough before I left a 16-year career at the Wall Street Journal. But it was an opportunity that felt very unique to work for a startup that was a blank sheet of paper that's owned by the company that owns the Atlantic magazine, which back in 2012, I felt had incredible credibility among traditional news organizations for making a transition to doing really good journalism online, to being ready to push print to the side with the goal of doing excellent journalism that would reach people no matter where they were. So I left the Wall Street Journal. I went to China for 2 weeks on my own as a sort of intellectual palate cleanser. And then I started on Quartz. We had a PR firm that did some pro bono work for us, or some barter work for us initially, and they were pressing, why Quartz? Why Quartz? What's the place of Quartz? We're saying, well, we're doing a global business news site, and they wanted to do this exercise, which some of you might have seen. It's called a blue ocean exercise, and the idea is you identify all of your potential competitors, and then you show how you're zagging where they're zigging, and so we had some foundational convictions about what Quartz would be. The PR people walked away and were convinced that there was no opportunity for Quartz because the Wall Street Journal was already there, The Economist was already there, MarketWatch was already there, Business Insider was already there. I'm happy to say that 2.5 years later, we have about 10 million readers a month. We have a reasonable business, but it is out of such skepticism that these things are born. So why Quartz? So Quartz, the idea of Quartz was that we wanted to create a global business news site that truly looked at the world from a view that wasn't stuck in the past, that wasn't neo-colonial, that wasn't rooted in a specific geography. The thought experiment that we did at the beginning, it was, if the Economist magazine was created now and not in 1843, what would it be? We did that out of great respect for the Economist magazine. Our takeaways were it would be mobile and tablet first, natively digital, it would be journalistic, and it would be truly global as much as possible in scope. And I'll walk through what some of those things mean. But our reader, the sort of reader that we're targeting, was a global business reader. So someone we think of as a post-national person who probably lives in a country other than they were born, and has a view of the world that goes beyond their own city and beyond their own country. And that was sort of the opportunity. What you're looking at is a bit of a manifesto that we launched the site with. And this is sort of how we put it in one of the images that, in trying to convey what we're doing, we used. So there's the global part and this group of readers who we're trying to reach. And then there's also the technology part. And what was clear even 3 years ago, that all of the growth in readership is on devices that look like this. And even business readers, actually, not just millennials, are actually getting all of their news on these sorts of devices, or the growth in news. Here's a very easy way to look at it. This is some e-marketer data that shows the convergence of mobile and desktop. If you look actually outside of the U.S. and some of the markets that we're thinking about, mobile is clearly even a much more important factor. Nigeria, even Germany, you can't see it, India, Mexico, Canada, which is one of our biggest markets where we're going as well. And there, at the moment we were born, this trend was sort of clear. This is a slide from the New York Times Innovation Report, where it's clear that readers, the result of the way that how people are consuming news is changing is, as you all know, is that you're not typing HuffingtonPost.com on or CNN.com into a web browser, but you're actually just getting things in the flow of your day. We realized if we wanted to go from 0 to 10 million readers a month, it would require us to walk away from a homepage. And so actually in the beginning, we didn't even have a homepage. So this is one of the other things we were thinking about. And then there's the global economy, which felt like a real opportunity for us to think about. And just briefly, this is Chinese ships off of Argentina that are fishing. You can see them on satellite images. So great is the demand for natural resources in every aspect from China that it stretches even into beyond its contiguous waters. This is a McKinsey chart that showed the shift of the center of gravity of the global economy over time. And we're in a moment of incredible change in this. This is from The Economist. Nigeria is a good one to watch in this. This is the most populous countries, and the forecast is by 2050, Nigeria, which is sort of nowhere here, is the third most populous country. So it was really clear to us is that we're in a time of seismic change in the world. The organizations, the publications that we liked the most were rooted in such seismic change. So The Economist in 1843, a time of great industrial, technological change. Fortune magazine in the 1930s, the birth of the corporation. Rolling Stone, late 1960s, early 1970s, time of great social change. Wired magazine in the early 1990s, which was the start, arguably, of the last, the technological revolution we've seen over the last 30 years. So our conviction is that if we could ride some of these macro trends, root ourselves in the seismic changes of the global economy, and serve a readership that honestly wasn't being fully served by news outlets that were far too often focused on print products, that they were turning to less and less for their news, and also not open to the reality that news actually exists beyond the borders of a city or a country, that there's an opportunity to cover in a way that is deserving of our times. So I'll mention it here because I probably won't get to it later. What we did, we had a tiny editorial team in the beginning. We had about 15 journalists working for Quartz. And we counted very early on, and we hired people who had a lot of experience internationally, came from the sort of backgrounds they were looking for. So our early team, I guess at the time we counted, was about 20 people, spoke over 20 different languages and had reported from 115 different countries. So the idea was to get a group of people together who reflected this. So I'm going to step into our, and this is Quartz, as you see, and we'll go into more detail, was born. I'm going to go into the name a little bit because this is a sort of challenge of any new venture of our time. Part of it is, as you know, it's impossible to find a URL, basically, and so your name is limited to something that has the word "the" at the beginning of it, or is 35 characters long, and no one is ever going to type in, and you're going to be reliant on Bitly. So this is we did some brainstorming after we got the initial team and some of the conception of Quartz together. This is the result of one of the initial brainstorming. The names are not very good at all. They're things like currency and abacus and net.net and macro, and they're sort of embarrassing. I cringe looking at this list. It turns out that the Atlantic, in a smart way, had bought for very little money, had bought the URL, the Atlas. And so that was sort of our straw man, that we had this URL that they owned, and we could be the Atlas. It wasn't great because it had the word "the," but it was a recognizable word. We could maybe inhabit that. With something. We worked with a sort of nerdy naming consultant who sort of pushed us to think beyond that. This is the brief on the brand. This is sort of embarrassing also, too. I cringe when I see this now. Opportunity. No one owns the physical reflex. Features and benefits include journalism. So anyway, this is sort of what we were working with. And these two folks who make a living off of this came back to us with this document and this concept of what they called the primum mobile, which they believe was a metaphor that was fitting for our business executives. And the primum mobile, I can't even remember what it means. It's the first mover, I guess. And the idea is that the business readers we're trying to target are concerned about time. They want to be first movers. It's all about the globe. They actually came, and I think one of the images is from here, with this to one of our brainstorming sessions with this copy of the Divine Comedy that one of them had bought, this antique copy, which one of them had bought in Venice. And this was their trump card in their effort to shame us away from using the Atlas as our name. So one of these images is, I think it's this one, I guess, comes from that antique copy of the Divine Comedy. And then they started showing us things like this. So they settled on they decided that the name Quartz was something we should consider. And we had all sorts of traditional concerns about this. Well, when you say it, it sounds like a legal site because it sounds like quartz, and or it sounds like a unit of measure. Quartz, is anyone ever going to? And they just said, basically, you have to own this. And there are these other brands that have done that. And what they pointed out with the brand that was interesting is that in the beginning, it's going to be a lot harder to call someone on the phone and say, I'm from Quartz, because you have to explain what it is, than it is to call, I'm from the New International Business Digest, or whatever, or the Atlas even, what you could be. But the opportunity over time was actually greater. And I think ultimately, and that our aspirations for Quartz go beyond a simple website that is a name that literally describes what it is. We're kind of word geeks by virtue of being journalists and people who edit and write a lot. It turns out that Q and Z are two of the least frequently used letters in the English language. That's reflected in their Scrabble score. And it turns out that the domain qz.com had just recently changed hands between someone in Korea and someone in China, and was actually kind of weirdly gettable for a price that was well within our budget. And so ultimately we sort of debated, should we call ourselves QZ or Quartz? And it felt like Quartz over time was something that we could own, and was a brand that and was actually a word that wasn't owned by anything in and that we could actually fill with meaning over time. So hopefully that's what we've done. Okay. I really almost never get asked the question, and I think part of it is this is a snarky Forbes article that appeared when we announced our name. This article is written once, and then people are bored with writing it, and so we sort of got it out of the internet system right away, and have never had to do. And I, again, I sort of cringe. My quote here is, "We like Quartz. It's a really interesting word on a number of levels." Clearly, I was media trained before doing this interview. But what I did hint at, actually, there is the choice ultimately came down between a more classic traditional name and something we felt was less conventional and possibly a little more surprising to people, like this Forbes reporter. I'm going to take a quick detour through some of the vestiges, the barnacles, the friction that exists in the media world before diving into the main topic, which is how we're producing what we're producing at Quartz and what our approach is. And I'll just go through this briefly. It turns out that there's a lot of vestiges in how news organizations run today of early 20th century newspaper manufacturing processes. And a lot of you may realize this already, but the most obvious one is headlines. So if you go to a traditional news organization, even today, it's very rare that the person who writes a story actually writes the headline for the piece. The reason for this is because in early 20th century newspaper manufacturing processes, they actually could not write the headline. It was physically impossible for them to write the headline because it was only the guys like these in the manufacturing process of a newspaper who were composing the pages who knew exactly how many characters you would have to actually set the type for the headline. These are the only people who could conceivably write the headline. Well, it turns out if you have the journalists, the reporters write the headline, they write really good headlines. And they write much better headlines often than the copy editor who at 7:25 at night is 15 minutes past the lockup for the third star edition of the newspaper and hasn't read the article. So there's one benefit of it. The second benefit of it is that it's actually a forcing mechanism for reporters. If you say, what is your headline, it forces them to focus on what's actually interesting. Why would someone conceivably read this article? If they can't come up with a headline, and we tell them the headline should be your tweet, because that's effectively how most people encounter an article. If you can't express in a concise form what is most profoundly interesting about what you're writing, you're probably not in a position to start writing it. And so we ask for a headline first. We let the headline change. It's not to the point of inaccuracy. Another vestige of newspaper manufacturing is this 750-word article. And this is basically the standard unit of production of a traditional news organization is an article that's 750 words, give or take a few hundred words. The reason for this is that it's really easy to make a paper by laying it out. This is probably a 750-word article. It jumps to the rest of the 750 words. This one does the same thing. There's sort of units of manufacturing production. It turns out that that's not what people read, and I'll talk about that. The other vestige, and this is a particularly glaring example, is that there's no integration of media. So things like charts are always like a box at the side that was prepared by someone else. And that's because all of the manufacturing systems in today's parlance, content management systems or CMSs, are actually just suited for text, and everything else is kind of a retrofit into these systems. This is an extreme example of setting the record straight with 700 words of text, with no interruption. One last example of vestiges is the lack of hyperlinks. So actually a lot of news organizations, it's impossible for reporters to add a hyperlink into a story. This is an example I pulled from 2 days ago off of a very large publisher's website. Clearly the reporter couldn't link because the processes wouldn't allow for it. So that's vestiges. And then there's barnacles, which are the fault of another set of individuals. And these are the practices that have grown up around web publishing over the last 25 years. The most egregious of them is arguably the right rail of a website. So this is called the right rail. Here's your ad. Here popular. And if you go down this page, this I just pulled this week from a news site, this is what is in the right rail. It sort of goes sort of like this. So you have an ad, which is a bad ad, and then you have some headlines that in theory are the most popular headlines. Then you have something called video news feed. Who knows what that is? And then you have an ad for platelet-rich plasma, an ad for railroad stores financing available in layaway, I guess it is. A local guide, search for a business, who knows what that is, and then another ad for free robot-assisted weight loss surgery. So it would be hard to argue that this is content that anyone cares about. And it turns out that the right rail of the site, which cites article pages, this was a practice that was pioneered 20 years ago when people wouldn't understand that ads and editorial content were different. It's a barnacle that's cropped up and needs to be, is a bad practice. The last thing is friction. And so when you're trying to get into people's feeds, it's really hard to have to stand things in the way from their accessing and sharing things. The best example from recent history for this was this revolutionary publication launched by News Corp around the launch of the iPad. So it would have been around 2010, 2011. It was called The Daily. I don't know if people remember this. It sort of came and went so quickly that you might have never noticed it or forgotten about it. It was interesting. And yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah, and it was launched with great fanfare, including Rupert Murdoch awkwardly holding this new device called an iPad on his hip. I've never seen anyone else quite do that one-handed hip maneuver, but there he is, looking very happy about the Daily. And the problem with the Daily is that it was an iPad app that you couldn't share anything. It was not on the web, and you had to register and subscribe. And so basically, one of the one of the points of friction that news organizations come up against is they create this friction between people doing what they should be doing, which is accessing the content and sharing it and spreading it as far possible beyond their website, because that's the only way that any of us actually sees anything, I'm convinced. The Daily, is Exhibit A in the failure of that strategy. So Quartz. This is sort of the background in the news industry. This is the change that is Quartz, basically. And our expectation from day one is that this is how people would actually reach us. We built a mobile app, HTML5 responsive web app, and we designed it so that actually for mobile and tablet first, and then did desktop last, which is very different from the traditional approach, which is people creating desktop websites and then retrofitting their RSS feeds to some mobile headline reader. And our focus was on the experience, this experience being a good experience. This is how you win or lose. And even more so, in the current moment in history, this is how you win or lose as a news organization. This is a Facebook mobile app. And so if your content doesn't actually succeed, is not accessible, is free of friction within someone else's app, you're really creating a lot of problems for yourself. And so that was our approach from day one. And we can, if anybody wants, we can talk more about our thinking about mobile apps versus web apps. Another thing, and I'm going to dive into this in a little more detail. Part of the change was that there was a clear opportunity to think of visual elements and as a key part of what our content was, and actually put the tools in the hands of every single journalist. This is an example on the left from the Wall Street Journal, and an example from the right from Quartz. And they're actually about exactly the same thing. It's incredibly convoluted U.S. immigration legislation, very difficult to understand textually, but if you actually set up a flow chart for the flow of what this legislation was proposing, I would argue it's a lot easier to understand. We actually translated that into Spanish, and it was even more popular with readers in Spanish than it was in English. So the core of what, there are a few sort of cores of what the Quartz approach are. One is what we call the Quartz curve, which is not actually a trademark, but we'll pretend that it is. The point of the Quartz curve, and one easy way to understand it is what we talked about before, is word count. So the standard unit of production of traditional media organizations is in the kind of valley of death here. The numbers are sort of arbitrary. On the y-axis, you have the likelihood of success that someone's actually going to read something that you've written. And it turns out that the readership online is actually at the extremes of this, which I think is good news for a lot of us. This is not strictly statistically accurate, I have to say that, but conceptually, it is it's how we operate Quartz and represents what we see in the readership data, both at Quartz and for the Atlantic. And so it turns out that what people read online is they read short, focused, shareable things, often with a visual element. We set the sort of somewhat arbitrary guardrail at 500 words. So things that are under 500 words that have a clear headline. What is this about? I think we've all read these articles that are 800, 900 words in the newspaper, and you think, like, why? That article would have been so much better if it was like 400 words and they didn't lard it up with stuff that I've read a billion times before and quote 3 financial analysts contradicting each other just because they felt that would lend credibility to their piece. Our approach is actually just have confidence that and know that what people read is actually short stuff. And I'll show you an example in a minute. The other like good piece of news is that people actually read long stuff as well. The most popular articles on The Atlantic, which actually is a very robust digital journalism activity, are the cover stories that they write for the magazine every month. So the current one, which is arguably on a pretty wonky topic, it's this Graham Wood piece on ISIS. It's 10,000 words long. Is one of the most popular pieces of content that Atlantic Media, the parent company, has ever published. The piece before that was the most popular, was another 10,000 word essay, this one by Ta-Nehisi Coates on the case for reparations. The piece before that was an 8,000 word essay by Anne-Marie Slaughter on why women can't have it all. The piece before that was an incredibly wonky article that was really long and arguably too long about viruses and how by studying viruses we can understand our society better. So the point is that people read short stuff and they read stuff where there's a payoff for them in terms of writing, reporting, narrative. In some cases, they're the visual. And so this is very much sort of the framework for how Quartz is approaching journalism. 2 very quick examples. One is actually just a tweet by one of our journalists, Matt Phillips. Apple's market cap just hit another record peak, $660 billion, astounding, very highly shared, very focused and visual, and did a piece this morning which was on, which the headline was something like, the coolest business cards we've seen in a long time, you can start a fire with. And it's a very visual piece that's just a few hundred words pointing out this like neat Canadian business card design. On the other hand, you have this article that our reporter Gwynn Guilford wrote, which is the economic case for paternity leave. It's 5,000 words. There are about 23 charts in the text of this article. And it made this argument that it's only when men consistently start taking paternity leave that we'll have more equality in the workplace. And she did this through an original economic argument that was really long and is one of our most popular pieces this year. I talked about how we're putting the tools in the hands of journalists. Alice referred to this in the introduction. We've created a series of tools for the journalists, and we operate just broadly using tools that the newsroom, they're very easy to pick up. We're using WordPress as our CMS, for example. And we expect all of our reporters to write their own headlines, find their own photos, crop their own photos, and actually build their own charts. So we built this tool called Chart Builder, which is a very simple tool. This is, you can see it right here, where you basically cut and paste data from the spreadsheet here check the format, you have a few options, what type of chart and label, and then you actually just click here and you have a chart in the Quartz style. We don't have a separate design interactive department as traditional newsrooms do. And it turns out that we made close to 4,000 charts. Our little staff made close to 4,000 charts in 2014. Here are some of them using this tool. So you put this tool in the hands of people. We've actually open sourced it. It's on GitHub. It's for free. It's now used by the Wall Street Journal and CNBC and NPR and 538, all sorts of other news organizations use it. We have another tool, which I won't show here, called Map Builder, which allows reporters to visualize data on maps. I'm going to show you a few examples of some of the stuff that we've done. So we have this reporter, Lily Kuo. This is a probably totally indecipherable without an explanation. So we have a reporter, Lily Kuo, who is a former Reuters reporter. She's based in Hong Kong. She went to, it wasn't Guangzhou, but to another Chinese city where Alibaba is based for Singles Day, which is the largest e-commerce day in the world. And she went in and she interviewed their CFO, and she was present there with a lot of other reporters. One thing that she wound up talking to them about was how they use data. Alibaba uses data about their consumers. And it turns out that one of the data sets that they literally have looked at is the correlation between women shoppers, online shoppers, bra sizes, because they know this if they've ordered bras, and their spending patterns. So Lily actually convinced them to give this data to her and created this chart using Chart Builder and included this as part of an article that she wrote about Singles Day and how Alibaba is this, probably the most important e-commerce player next to Amazon in the world. I use this chart because it's a reporter in the field who did this on her laptop, who extracted this kind of weird but telling data set from the company. And she was looking for, this is not the data set that CNBC or all those other publications, I named at the beginning, that the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times or these other guys presumably would lead with. She's looking for actually what would be most interesting and surprising to people and most telling. And the fact that Alibaba was studying the correlation between bra sizes and spending power seemed like a powerful way to do that. That's one example. We do actually have a few visual designers on staff who do their own reporting, and this is Nikhil Sanad, who is in some ways the sort of archetype of the Quartz reporter. He grew up in America. He went to University of Michigan, studied in Ecuador, speaks Spanish fluently, moved to Taiwan, learned Mandarin, taught himself programming, moved to Australia, worked for the ProPublica of Australia, which closed, and then we wound up getting him. And I mean, he's like 26 or something like that. It sounds like he should be 55. But this is an example of how we're trying to use data sets that are not only important but actually interesting. This is a correlation between, as you can see, Disney heroines and the U.S. baby names. Jasmine was a large one, as was surprisingly Wendy from Peter Pan. This is another bespoke interactive data-based thing. I was in Tokyo recently meeting with some executives from NTT, and they kept saying, how are you different from the Wall Street Journal? How are you different from these other news organizations? And they're struggling with this question. I showed them this, and they were like, okay, we get it. This is a data set of every single active satellite orbiting above the Earth. And we did a data visualization that's interactive, and you can see which of these are spy satellites, which have commercial purposes, and that, in fact, satellites, a lot of them oscillate in terms of their altitude above the Earth, because to keep a stationary position, they have to do that. So I can send along a link to that. It's not oscillating in this presentation. Here's another bespoke visualization that we've done. it's arguably too pretty for what it is, which is the mergers and acquisitions in the global beer industry. This was actually not incredibly popular, and I think it's because it was too pretty. And I'm going to duck out of here and just show you this really quickly. This is an example of a live Quartz page. Again, it's a Lily Kuo. And the reason I show it to you is to convey what I talked about earlier, which is this idea that all of Quartz's journalists need to be designers. So Lily is based in Hong Kong. She covered the student protest live, wrote some incredible coverage. This is one of the first ones that was talking about how the demographics of it were changing. She found this photograph. This is a Reuters photograph, which conveys the point really strikingly. She took this photograph. She embedded this map. She found this photograph from Reuters. She took this photograph. She did her own translating from Mandarin, and that's the end of the article. But you can see how different this is from some of the other examples I was talking about earlier. And also, while we're at it, you can notice that Quartz does not have a right rail, and our advertising looks like this. And the do I screen the advertising? For like sort of quality standards, or
just how cool it looks, I guess.
So our advertising side, which is separate from me, actually works with the advertisers and tries to convince them to produce ads that take as good advantage as possible of the space. This is one that's very visually striking. A lot of them are video, and what you can see actually just while I'm on it is that it's probably not confusing to readers that this is an ad. I would argue the right rail has outlived its requirement, and the virtue of actually giving over that space to having an article in between, an advertisement in between articles, is that we actually get 100% of the width. We don't give up that 35% of the width to be able to run a photograph like this. It's an incredibly striking image. You could not do this on a traditional news site with the right rail, and so. The result is, I think, ultimately a victory for readers. The other thing I'll note, which Quartz I think was one of the pioneers of and has been, subsequently used a lot by other people, is it's just a continuous scroll. So we don't actually make you click; we just take you into the next article, and hopefully have found a great photograph like this. One is actually pretty good for a kind of wonky article. All right, let me see if I can get back to my keynote. So hopefully you have a sense of how Quartz works and how we, if I play, kind of what we're doing. Humor is part of it. We did this. We've done tax avoidance power rankings, which for those of you who are into international finance are pretty funny. We played with things like guessing where people are from their accents. It's actually really hard, but there's a great data set that you can build something like this with. And the core of what we're doing is journalists. Basically, we've hired, you can see some of them. Anne is on the lower left there. This is where people worked. These are people who have a lot of experience, have confidence in what they're writing, are able to find things that are interesting, and that's sort of, if you have any anxiety about the future of journalism, I would argue that this slide, which is at the core of what we're doing, reinforces for you that there are actually places where people who practice really quality journalism are thriving. So to finish off, I wanted to briefly touch on some of the other changes that are happening. Change is, even in the 2.5 years that Quartz has been around, change is really intense. So this is a look at our referrals from both Facebook and LinkedIn shared next to each other. We've got a great start with Quartz. LinkedIn was linking to our articles all the time. We're going to hit 10 million readers in no time. Whoops, LinkedIn stops linking to us. So there's a moment where LinkedIn and Facebook were kind of running in parallel, it turns out that LinkedIn's actually, their strategy changed. And they started linking to stuff that people like Richard Branson, are publishing on their own, on the LinkedIn platform. And why would they link to a Quartz article when they have on LinkedIn.com Richard Branson's article, which is 3 tips for motivating your teams, which there is actually a pretty big, readership for, if you combine celebrity and that sort of content. But it turns out that, so this change is really a constant in terms of this model. It turns out that Facebook, as you all know, is the way that people find news. And while LinkedIn has trailed off, Facebook has come back. It looks like LinkedIn may be coming back now. We're trying to be very zen about it. Because when you look at this kind of in aggregate, how many readers we have, the overall trend is really good. And so our conviction is that producing quality stuff, ultimately there's a readership for it and it will find its readers. Another change that I think people anticipate, but is very clear, has a lot of implications for anyone who does anything on the web practically, is the emphasis that Facebook is bringing to video. Quartz has not had video until now. We're just in the process of hiring 3 video journalists. Not directly because of this. We knew that video would be part of our storytelling in the way that visuals were, but we also knew that it's easy to do poor video, and it's easy to lose money and spend a lot of money doing poor video. So we now have some conviction around it. Mobile news apps are another approach that's being taken in the industry. It's another way to reach readers. I'm not convinced that that's the ultimate victory for news organizations, but everybody, including BuzzFeed, is heading there. There's a great quote here. Ben Smith, who's their editor-in-chief, says, journalists should realize, quote, that they're part of a collaborative project with other news outlets, which hopefully people have figured out by now. And BuzzFeed is actually an interesting, just in terms of where things are going, it's an interesting way to think about it. So basically, BuzzFeed thinks of itself, this is a Jonah Peretti slide, thinks of itself as its sort of core is people making stuff, and that stuff kind of goes out into the world. It goes on the web, it goes in apps, it goes out through other platforms. And I think that that's how we think about Quartz a lot of ways. What we do is we create really quality content. You could argue we're like a film studio, or we're an API, and in fact, we have a really robust open API. Because our success over time in writing these changes is actually reducing the friction, trying to minimize the barnacles, get rid of the vestiges of media in the past. And this is one way in which you can see a representation of how we think about it. This number I find sort of suspect. This is not a number. 250 million people is our social reach around the world. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but you get the point that we do have a large social presence. We have visitors on QZ.com. We actually have visitors on Flipboard, Smart News, Google Newsstand. We have another 1 million visitors. We have an email product, which is called the Quartz Daily Brief, which was one of the first, arguably of its kind in terms of these very high-touch email newsletters. We have about a 50% open rate for it. And it's about not bringing people back to our site, but actually making sure that our content succeeds in your inbox and that you can just read it. You don't actually have to click back on it. And we're both getting reader loyalty and advertising is actually appearing on that. This, in terms of everything that we're doing, this is arguably the most important number, which is our revenue, basically. And there are a lot of currents that we're riding, but this is one ultimately that's sort of guiding our efforts to find a model for digital journalism where quality content can actually thrive online. And so far we have a lot of conviction about where things are heading. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Kevin, that was fabulous. Will you join me for
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Q&A.
Yes.
Come over. That was fascinating. And thank you for just, delving in and sharing so many aspects of, what appears to be your very busy days.
Yes.
I wonder if we could start out by, so I'm going to hog the Q&A for a few minutes, and then we'll open up to the students and then others. But
Yeah.
I wondered if we could start out by talking little bit more about how you measure successful reading. You talked about that, this was a successful piece, and I know that some other sites are using things like timing people, how long they're reading for example, and then of course there's clicks, but you're a scroll. So, so could you just talk us through the process of that, how you do or measure success, and how you decided not to measure success?
Yeah. So at a very, very base level, the marker that we have is our number of readers, and the reason we're focused on this is because it's very easy to distort basically any other measure. Page views are not credible. There's an emerging sort of thinking, as Alice has referred to, that time on site is something that you could start measuring. It's actually hard to measure that. The data around that are not. I don't have full confidence in time on site because people actually, as you know, visit a page and then they leave, or they sort of walk away, and so the metrics we don't have full biometric sort of hookup into the online data to be able to know when you've walked away from your computer. So what we look at a very high level is users. We actually do look at page views, even though we have continuous scroll on our site. We trigger a new URL, so we trigger a page view. Technically, when you enter a new article. This seemed like a fair thing for us to do because you are on any other site, you'd actually be in another article. We don't paginate our articles like some sites do. So in some ways, for a 5,000 word article, we count it as one page view. We do occasionally dive into the amount of time that people spend on an article. It's not a core. When we've gone into it, what we found is that a significant enough percentage of the readers are getting to the end of the long articles even, and so it's not a metric that we obsess about at the moment, to be honest.
And to what extent then are the writers, do they have to be involved in all of that?
Yeah.
In terms of are they rewarded financially for the number of readers? Is that
So this is an area of some sort of discussion and controversy in the media industry, as a lot of you probably know. Do you pay people by traffic? And there are a lot of sites that actually do, and you could argue that if payment is the ultimate incentive, and your goal is to grow your readership, then that's the best way to do it. In my experience, when you have journalists who are solely focused on traffic, it's actually distorting because there are some topics and some approaches that are really obvious traffic drivers. And so traffic and you can ask Anne for her view on this from being a writer, but traffic is something that we actually talk about a lot in the newsroom. Our traffic data is available on Chartbeat and Google Analytics and Omniture, and the journals all have full access to that. And we talk about the stories that are doing well. So traffic is an active reader way of gauging reader feedback, basically. But it's not something that we're compensating people on it.
Okay, so shifting slightly, I also want to know a bit more about design at Quartz, because we've had discussions about this in the past, but for the benefit of everyone else, tell us a bit about what a news meeting is like, and what kinds of how you make your decisions about which design stories get played out or not.
So a lot of organizations, we're using this software called Slack, which is collaborative software. We used to use GChat. Slack is much better. And so we shifted to that. And it's been incredibly powerful, particularly as our news organization has grown, because we have people in many different time zones. We have 5 reporters in India. We have people in Hong Kong, in London, in both coasts of the US. And what it does is it's software that actually gives us at the risk of sounding like an advertisement for Slack, it's a way to actually run a virtual newsroom because there's full transparency to the process, and we have newsrooms to talk about news meetings to talk about strategy, but we don't have a traditional editorial meeting where the editors get together around the boardroom table and talk about what's going to be on page 1, the following day. We had meetings like that at the beginning, but it became really clear that there was not a good time in a day to have them where everybody, all of the staff could really participate. And then effectively, it was much more important to have a transparent process of communication and visibility into what people were talking about. And so what happens, to actually get to your question about like how we choose stories, what happens is that Anne or another reporter will either talk to their editor directly or throw out to the group, I've been thinking of doing something about on this topic. Does this sound like something that people would want to read? And so it flattens the news organization a lot of way, because it's basically anyone in the news organization has a viable opinion on that is something I'd want to read or not, or often I read an article about this might be interesting context for you. And so we're very much reporter driven with lots of feedback from editors and actually from readers about what people are reading. One wrinkle for Quartz is that we expect our reporters to have what we call obsessions, and these are basically another way of talking about beats. An obsession is different from a beat in that it's effectively a thesis about the area that you cover, as opposed to the fact that there is an area that you happen to be covering. So a traditional beat would be the US auto industry, the European pharmaceutical industry, congressional politics. And in fact, what obsessions at Quartz are much more like are the next billion, which is our observation that there were 3 billion people connected to the internet as of last year. There's 1 billion people who are projected to be connected to the internet over, roughly every few years for the next few years. Our thesis is that is one of the most important macro business, technology, education, medical, societal trends. And so instead of just saying I cover technology, our reporters have an area of obsession.
Smart way to do things. Just finally, before I open up, I was really just intrigued by that graph showing the rise of Nigeria in the sort of global populations, and then the fact that you guys are launching in Africa in June, right? Yeah. What does that encompass and involve, and what does it mean to launch in a different continent like that? I mean, what's your thinking behind that?
So the model for this is India, actually, where we noticed about a year and a half ago, pretty soon after the launch of Quartz, there were actually a lot of readers in India. A number of people on our staff, Mitra Kalita, Bobby Ghosh, had professional experience in India, and we thought, we should really put some journalists there and try and actually build that Indian readership. And so last June, just about a year ago, we launched Quartz India, and what this means is that there's a geo-targeted homepage for our site that has a greater density of stories about India that our readers who are located physically in India see. We now have 5 journalists who are working in India whose content is actually visible to our readers worldwide, and roughly 10% of our readership, so about 1 million readers today come to Quartz each month from India. So there's an opportunity to actually reach and we have an advertiser who was interested in reaching that readership, being around that content. So it's actually a pretty viable business model. So we just announced last week or the week before that we're adopting a similar model for Africa. And what this means is that we're going to have make a play at reaching an African readership. On a monthly basis, we have somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 readers who are located in Africa, and we're putting a handful of journalists in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa to start, to write about business stories in Africa for a global readership, but also for the readers in Africa. Our conviction was that the macro trends totally support this. So there's the Nigerian population. 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world right now are based in Africa. And it's a pretty easy argument to make that while traditional news organizations do a really good job of covering crises, rebellions, contagion, in Africa, they don't actually do a great job of covering a lot of the innovation and on the ground there, because they don't actually have people on the ground there, except for people who almost literally parachute in moments of crisis. I would argue that some of the best managers in the world today are in Africa, and no one is reading about them. They are people who have experience dealing with incredible uncertainty, because that's a reality in a lot of the countries in which they're operating. And that experience is actually, one of the most valuable things you could bring to being a CEO on the global stage. So as of June, we'll have a bunch of journalists and more of an offering for readers in Africa.
Great. Okay, let's take some questions from the students first and then open up. Sorry, hold that thought. This is Lisa.
I'm curious what you think about citizen journalism in the internet age, and other than being a designer, what's the role of a journalist in this century then?
Oh, that's interesting. So on citizen journalism, I don't know. I think of it. I think of citizen journalism as being social media in some ways. So I think readers and citizens have more of an impact than ever on our news cycle. There was a moment where news organizations tried to brand and control this. And so organizations like CNN and newspapers had citizen journalism initiatives, which meant that they would take what people were saying on social media or in their common fields, and they would bring it back onto their own platform. I think citizen journalism is thriving more than ever, but I'm actually kind of glad that news organizations have stopped trying to co-opt it, because there are great platforms. There's Twitter and Facebook and WordPress and Medium and all these places that they're amazing writers. And in terms of how Quartz thinks about it, we're looking for readers who are obsessed about the same things that our journalists are obsessed with. We want to connect with them on these other platforms. We want to be present on these other platforms for them. And often we'll actually ask them to contribute. We have external contributors. And so if someone writes a really interesting essay or a comment, we'll go back at them and say, do you want to write something? So we're trying to bring those voices in, but I think the idea that you have citizen journalism is this thing that needs to be sanitized by media organizations day has sort of come and gone in a healthy way. So the other thing is, what is the role of the journalist? And this is another question that news organizations have been grappling with. I think at the core what a journalist is someone who has a deep curiosity about the world and is able to identify what is at the intersection of what's important and what is interesting, and actually write or design or use whatever medium to bring that to their readers. So we found this in our hiring, that at moments our instinct has been to hire people who have traditional journalism background and sort of check all the boxes of having written 750-word stories and having a track record of not libeling people and being able to deal with screaming PR people and sort of these things that you learn in the trenches at a big news organization. All of that can actually be learned, I'm convinced. So if you have a real curiosity about an ability to identify what is actually interesting, that's the core job of the journalist, and then you need to be able to express it in writing or visuals or however. But I'm less and less attached to the some of the things that traditional news organizations value in identifying and rewarding and promoting journalists.
I mean, I think it's quite possible, sorry, just to go on that there are probably designers in the room and elsewhere who wouldn't necessarily characterize what you just showed us as design.
Yeah.
You know, this is, it seems to me that it's a very, you know, it's a natural evolution of what you're describing, the skill set of the journalist expanding into visual means. But do you also just think that there's a bunch of stuff that is kind of lost by a designer not being able to add another layer of, say, interpretation or pacing or the other things that a designer might have traditionally done?
Yeah. So Quartz views design as part of its core. And so we believe greatly in design, and can back me up on this. And I've been desperate, actually, to have really good design coverage at Quartz, because I think it's an area that is not done in as high volume or quality as it should be. And and welcome any input about our design coverage from you all. Quartz is home to probably 5 people who would professionally categorize themselves as designers. So there are designers who are employed, and who are employed at the very core of what Quartz is doing, on the advertising side, on the product side, in our ranks of journalists. And what we're trying to do is maximize their impact by giving tools to the journalists to use these visual tools. I wouldn't say that the journalists, when I say that journalists are designers, I don't mean it literally in some ways, but we want them to think like designers and actually understand the potential of that. And we have professional designers who work with them and train them. So, yeah.
All right, sorry, I butted in again. Trilby, yeah.
You mentioned that you're bringing in some video people. I'm wondering if you have thought about podcasts also. I know the Times is now really sort of focusing on original podcast content.
So like email newsletters, podcasts have enjoyed a resurgence. And the reason within newsrooms podcasts fell out of favor, even while they were actually, arguably popular with listeners, was that our advertising salespeople gave up on selling them. They basically said, no one wants to buy podcasts, there's no revenue in it. And so the product and newsroom side of news organizations actually kind of walked away from podcasts or diverted their focus from them. It turns out that that's not actually true. There are lots of people who are making good money doing podcasts, and it's pretty obvious that there is a good listenership for podcasts. So Quartz has been producing a podcast kind of secretly, and I can share with you the URLs. We actually publish it on our site. So if you search Quartz podcast, you can probably find it. And we're doing it in partnership with Marketplace, the American Public Media radio show. And our thinking on that was that we didn't internally have audio expertise, and we feel sort of kindred with some of the spirit of Marketplace radio. They haven't done a ton beyond putting their radio show online digitally, and so they saw us as a good partner for doing this. So we actually have a podcast. We haven't announced it because we've been spending far too much time trying to come up with a name for it. But we've been doing it behind the scenes, and we've actually been publishing it online. And we think it's we're really excited to experiment and think that we've hit on personalities and formats that people really respond to.
Granite is available.
Granite, yeah. Feldspar. Yeah.
How often do you publish?
Yeah.
Like, do you have like a publishing schedule?
Yeah.
Or do you just put things up whenever they're ready? And do you have different features that a traditional publication has?
Yeah. So how often do we publish, and do we have traditional features? So in terms of the frequency of publication, we publish in the range of 40 to 50 pieces a day, and they're done, kind of as they're ready. It turns out that the morning, our time, is a particularly good time for readership because it's the overlap between Asia, Europe, and the US. About half of our readers are outside of the US, and so it's true for a lot of news organizations, but the morning is a particularly good time. So we'll often, if it's 4:30 p.m. and we have a feature story that could be published the following morning, we'll often just hold it and publish it at 5 or 6 a.m. because that's a moment when our readership we have the greatest confidence that people will see it at the moment of publication, and so that's when we do it. In terms of standing features, I didn't mention it, but there are lots of kind of assumptions that are vestiges or barnacles or friction, like depending on which category you want to put them in. And one of them is the assumption that people go to read standing columns, or they go to read standing features in a newspaper. And it turns out that standing features are often an impediment to someone finding the most interesting thing to write about. And so what happens, and this is my own experience, I briefly had a column for the Wall Street Journal in 1999, and it was about technology, and I was the vacation sub-in for Walt Mossberg's column for a while. So what happens is it's a sort of forcing function. It forces you to write, to have a standing feature. And you could argue that in a newspaper, the prominence of a column by someone like Walt Mossberg helped to establish them as a personality. It turns out that like the way that people actually find our stories is that they find them in their feeds, and there's no furniture around them. It's just a headline and maybe an image. And so the conceit of a recurring feature is actually not particularly helpful and is in many ways a distraction. And so what you do is you have things that you do over time and time again. So they're different, effectively templates for how we treat things. Like one example that we and tons of other places do is when there's a news event, they publish something that says how to watch something live, how to watch the World Cup live, or how to watch the, horrific German airplane crash live as it unfolds. And it turns out that there's a pretty standard format you can bring to that, and there's a pretty standard readership that you can expect when you do that. So that's an example. Chart posts, coverage of earnings, things like that. We have things that are effectively templates because you don't have to reinvent the form every time. But in terms of standard features like columns, it doesn't make a lot of sense the way we're operating.
Anna-Marie, yeah.
Can you talk about your own reading regimen?
I'm a really incredibly atypical reader, and or maybe I'm typical in some ways. I read a ton of stuff. I read probably 70+% of what I read on my phone. I have an iPhone 6 Plus because it gives me the largest screen in a phone, which I use for reading. I read stuff that comes to me in my feeds. I use a bunch of apps like Nuzzle that sort of curate some of the stuff that's flowing through feeds that I may not have noticed that lots of people that I follow look at. I look at the NYT Now mobile app on my commute home because I'm going by subway. I need something that's cached, so I look at Instapaper and NYT Now because I get a good summary of New York news, which I don't bump into in my feeds. Otherwise, I read books and magazines on my phone, and I guess there's some apps that I go to directly, but a lot of it is just stuff that sort of comes to me on the global internet tides that wash in and out of our lives.
Very true. Leaving flotsam and jetsam with them. Yes.
So most of the articles are range of the 500 to 800 or thereabouts, but those longer ones, is there any particular strategy of timing of when those get published?
Yeah.
So that the audience might
So what we do is actually, just to be super clear, we do stuff that's shorter than 500 words. We do sometimes stuff between 500 and 800 words, but try to stay away from that because it's less likely to produce something where there's a real payoff or that's more focused. In terms of the timing of publishing them, we generally publish them in the morning because that's our time of maximal readership. There is a theory that you should publish them in the evening because that's when people read longer stuff, or on weekends. We've looked at the data around that. I'm not convinced that publishing at that moment is actually the best strategy, because effectively what happens is that people often will bookmark or save to Pocket or Instapaper, or and that might be the moment that they read it. It's not necessarily the moment that you need to actually be publishing that stuff. And so we just publish that stuff at the moments, which turns out our morning, where we have the maximal readership. We're also dealing with a global readership, and so it's hard to game when someone's evening is versus someone's evening is someone else's morning. So it's not. We haven't seen a lot of reward in timing that otherwise.
Are there any new, say, ethical challenges, or maybe like journalistic risks or editorial risks associated with the highly decentralized model or the distribution models you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean the like when you had a 5-day-a-week newspaper that an editor in New York saw before it went to, was a gatekeeper to, it's clear that you could control the any potentially messy scenario that could erupt. A large part of our content publishes while, in the 3.5 hours a day when I'm sleeping, and an even larger portion of it is stuff that I don't see before publication. So one of our practices, which I think is good is that there's a second set of eyes on everything that's published. So there is another journalist, another editor who looks at everything. And our expectation is if there's something that's potentially problematic because it's inaccurate or libelous or whatever the problems could be, the second, if that's not identified by the first person, the second person could do it. In terms of the categories of things that we see, accuracy is really the biggest challenge in a fast publishing scenario. And so our practice is that when we write something, particularly something negative about someone or a company, we contact them and ask them for a comment. It turns out that this is not only a great way to keep them from screaming at you after you've actually published it, but it actually is a good practice and averts mistakes that you could have made inadvertently without reaching someone. It's like always good practice, even if they are not going to comment or don't agree with what you're saying, to actually hear them out. The window between when we ask for comment and publish it is sort of arbitrary. I generally make sure that we leave at least a half an hour longer if it's actually something that's pretty sensitive. But it's often communications people won't get back to you in that window, and the consequence of that is what we have to live with, basically. And also you have to be really good about correcting things as a result of that. And Quartz has a pretty transparent, where we say at the top of the post, if we correct it, this post has been corrected, and then explain in detail at the bottom of it what we've done.
Any last question? Yeah, this will be the last one.
You talked some about partnerships. You mentioned the partnership with Marketplace, and we've heard for a long time that like advertising, just the way that you talked about advertising has kind of helped or not helped different kind of platforms. I was wondering if there are other partnerships or other like types of revenue generation that you've been looking at. Yeah. You obviously focus a lot on actual advertising or traditional advertising. I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, so in terms of our business model, we basically have 3 streams of revenue. The largest one is advertising on QZ.com. And we have two types of advertising. One is the display advertising, like that ad that you saw. The other one is native content. So it's content produced by brands or our ad sales department. That could be an article. It's like the advertorial content, basically. So those are the two main ones. We also do events. The Atlantic is the sort of gold standard in this. They've do tons of events. It's a great revenue stream for them. They co-founded the Aspen Ideas Festival with the Aspen Institute 10 years ago. And we have an ongoing, we've done a bunch of different kinds of events. Our kind of flagship is called The Next Billion, which is born out of that obsession with the next billion people coming online. It's a full day event that we've done in New York twice, Seattle, we're doing in London in May. We're doing an event in Africa over the summer, New Delhi in October, and New York in October. We get a little bit of revenue from syndication. So this is other news organizations that pay us basically to republish our content, and that's it. In terms of other revenue streams, our conviction is actually there's a lot of room to grow on all three of these revenue streams: advertising, event sponsorship, and syndication. And so those are, that's our focus going forward.
Right. Well, I would like to invite you all to come into the reading room, and we will explore the intersection between wine and snacks. But before we do that, can we all please thank once again Kevin.